Welcome to the Beyond the Reiki Gateway podcast with Reiki Masters Kathleen Johnson and Andrea Kennedy. Journey with us and let's explore what lies beyond the Reiki Gateway.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Beyond the Reiki Gateway. This is Kathleen, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrea Kennedy. Today, we have yet another amazing guest, Gayle Revels. Gayle is an energy healer and specializes in helping people remove attached energy so that they can regain their sovereignty. Gayle is also an empath and an intuitive, and she says that the energy and the beings in a room are a palpable presence for her. And as a child, and even today, she can hear them, and she frequently talks to them. As a child, the adults in her life thought she had a really great imagination, but she decided that some things were better to not talk about in public. She has taken that wonderful gift and translated it into working with people to clear and improve their energy and their life. So, Gayle, welcome. We are so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
We sure are, Gayle. I'm so excited to delve into this with you.
Oh, thank you. It's so great to meet both of you and your audience.
Thank you. I'm sure they're going to be delighted to hear from you as well. Now, this is, I'm sure you would agree, this is a really specific, kind of an unusual career. And I find it fascinating. And I would love to know, other than being able to hear beings in the room, how did you ultimately get into this as a line of work and working to help people?
It really started for me with being able to hear. They started talking to me when I was, 3 years old. And I used to have major dreams about dragons. Dragons would show up for me every night and we would visit all over the world. And between the two really freaked out my parents because I would get up in the morning and talk about this wonderful place I had been that I had obviously never been as a 3-year-old. And I could really describe it in major detail. The voices for me when I was younger were often ancestors. So an ancestor who wasn't particularly healthy would say, "Hey, go tell your grandmother this." And I would, and it would be the big, deep, dark family secret.
Oh.
And it caused major drama. Like, how does the 3-year-old know the big family secret? And that's when I learned to shut up.
Oh, my goodness.
So then I spent a lot of years trying not to hear because hearing was always getting me in trouble. But then around my 30s, I started really getting into energy work. I started studying Reiki, which I loved. And then Reiki made me more sensitive, which then made it harder for me not to hear. So, because I just got more and more sensitive, and the walls I had built to keep everything out started coming down. And suddenly it was just like, oh, I can't ignore this anymore. And so then I started studying mediumship. I was like, okay, what am I hearing? How can I make this stop? One of my teachers said, hey, we're going to talk about energies that are stuck. And there's 2 types. There's solid things that are like maybe a thought or some words that got stuck in the body, kind of like a splinter. And then there's fluid things that get stuck, and those are alive. And we're not talking about those in this class. If you want to learn more about that, you have to go study somewhere else. And it was like somebody put a bell over my head and rang it. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but that's what I'm supposed to be doing in the world. And that started me down a long path of studying and realizing that part of what I was hearing was that. And so I find great joy in helping people figure out what's the voice in the back of their head that's not actually there. That's going, hey, you should do this or you should do that. I was like, oh, that's not you. So if we removed that, then you could make a choice based on what you want and not what someone else wants. And that's kind of where it all got started.
Wow. I'm really thinking of so many things to ask you in the moment. My goodness. When you were saying that you were in that class and she said the solid and then the fluid, oh, but we're not talking about that. I just was like, oh, that would just be a moment to remember. And you just kind of said that about that bell ringing. I'm really interested in what does that mean? Can we talk about that fluid type?
Of course, yes.
What does it mean to have a spirit attachment? How prevalent are they? What's some good background foundational stuff that you can tell us about that sort of energy?
Sure. Spirit attachments are actually really, really, really common. And most of us have them. Spirit attachments kind of fall into two big categories. And I think the one most everybody has are our ancestors. So when I talk about ancestors, there's really two types in big, broad categories here. Obviously, there's lots of exceptions, but two big types. And some ancestors are healthy. So they're loving and kind. When they left their human body, they transitioned back into the spirit world. We pray to them, they help us. It's beautiful, wonderful, kind ancestors. And I'd say a vast, vast majority of them. I often tell clients 80, 90%. I have no idea how to qualify that honestly, but a vast majority of them are healthy. And the ones that are a problem in my world, and when I start talking about spirit attachments, I'm talking about that 10% that when their body died went, no, I'm not leaving, I'm staying here. And if they stay here without transitioning into the spirit world, well, they don't have a body anymore and they don't have a power source anymore. Our bodies create that life force energy that our spirits use to be here. So it's that synergy between body and soul that makes us us. So without the body, if they still want to stay or have to stay for some reason, then they have to get their energy from somewhere, and they tend to stay with the ones they love because that's why they wanted to stay to begin with, usually. And so they stay with their spouse or their kids, and then they borrow some of their energy to stay here and to stay active. That's a really common type of spirit attachment. You would think if they stayed with their spouse and then their spouse dies, physically body, then maybe they would move to spirit with their spouse. But then the spouse goes, oh, you can stay? Why don't we stay with our kids?
Oh,
And so now the kids, instead of having one, they have two. They don't cause a lot of problems. I mean, they can cause a lot of distraction. If they have a strong agenda, they can really manipulate and block things for us, which is what shows up in my
mm.
practice. You're like, I have this block, or I'm a computer engineer and I've got this thought in the back of my head that I want to move to the country and raise cows, and I don't know where that comes from. I was like, oh, I know where that comes from. That's an ancestor.
Oh,
And it's usually one that's been around for a long time. So you'll find ancestors that have been here for 200, 300 years. They're still trying to help,
Wow.
but their idea of what is help was their lived experience, which can be quite old. And then when they say, oh, that's not safe, like it's not safe to do that. I see that around magic a lot, but they can also say that's not safe for a woman to buy a house by herself. You have to get married. Your spouse has to buy a house.
oh my
So then you
goodness.
go to buy a house and nothing works. You're like, I can't get this to work or that to work. It's always blocked. And that's a helping ancestor. Yeah,
That is mind blowing. Oh my
it's
goodness.
really cool.
That brings whole new meaning to living with your parents, doesn't it? My goodness.
Wow.
Certainly does. Living with your great 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 grandparents.
Andrea, if any of our children are listening to this, they're probably all shuddering about right now. Like,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, I know. My brain was just in overdrive as she was talking about that, and how interesting that would be to have the time dynamic in there, right? And the beliefs of the old days
Yeah.
coming in. I mean, I never even
Yeah.
thought of
Yeah.
that, but it makes perfect sense because those influences from them in spirit, of course, would match their earthly experience. But yeah, I never thought of that.
And even when they're more close to us in time, my parents are gone, but they're more close to our current time. But even when they were alive, we didn't always agree. I was like, I didn't
Mhm.
always want to do what my mom wanted me to do.
Right.
But now she's in the back of my head, and she's not, but she could be in the back of my head, but
Mhm.
she's attached to my energy body. So it feels like me. So it feels like you. It takes a little bit of teasing it out. There's also real physical signs when this is happening. You're like, suddenly I'm really tired, or something
Mm.
in my body hurts that didn't hurt before. You'll see someone maybe who passed in a motorcycle accident, and when they had their motorcycle accident, maybe they broke their arm. Then they're really confused and they don't transition and they come stay with you, say it's your brother. And you're like, well, my brother died in a motorcycle accident. And ever since my arm is hurt. And you go to the doctor, and the doctor goes, there's nothing wrong with your arm. And it's because the pain belongs to the spirit and doesn't belong to you.
What about chronic illness? Can we develop chronic disease from having spirit attachments that hang around?
We definitely can. In my experience, I mean, it's obviously not absolute, but quite a few of the autoimmune issues that medicine can't figure out It's our body is sharing our life force energy with other things. And after a while, it just doesn't have enough. And so certain things just don't work the way they're supposed to anymore. And it causes illness.
Do you see with your clients after they clear that energy, does their health improve? Do you see that a lot?
It is quite common for your energy level to improve. Some things that have been chronic for a long time, they take a while to readjust. So
Mm,
it's not like you instantly don't have Hashimoto's or whatever it is that you're talking about, but it does start shifting the body. And sometimes things are really immediate. So I see this more with non human things than human. But if you have a non human spirit attachment, they can really, if their energy level naturally is, say, much higher than yours, can really jump your blood pressure. And so that being leaves and your blood pressure suddenly drops because your body's not trying to match or modulate this being that has a very different energy than yours. So I'm usually asking people, what drugs are you on? Because I'm looking for that. If I don't want to know the exact drug name, but I want to say, oh, I am on prescription drugs. So that if I do remove something really big like that, I'm like, you probably want to talk to your
mhm.
doctor. I'm not telling you to
Right.
change your meds. I'm not a doctor, but you want to pay attention if suddenly you don't need the same amount of meds.
Right, which is actually common in all kinds of energy healing, even Reiki, that sometimes dosage needs
Mhm.
to be adjusted. Yes, absolutely.
Definitely.
So you mentioned non-human beings, Gail. Can you give us some examples of what those might be and how they might differ in their effect on us as opposed to human entities?
I think I was saying in the beginning, there's kind of two types of spirit attachments. One's our ancestors, and the other is usually non human, but not always. We can have human things that are attached that are not ancestral. So, especially if you do like hospice work or you work in a hospital and someone passes who's scared and confused, and you're lovely and light and feel comfortable, you might end up with things there as well. But most of the time, they're not human. And when we find not human things, there's usually a problem. So non-human things don't generally tend to hang out with us in our world attached by their own free will. So sometimes they do. Maybe we, in a past life, we were much more magical and we had a partnership and an agreement, and now they're stuck with us because we made an agreement forever, which humans always think of forever as this one lifetime. But we're making an agreement with a being who lives a lot longer than we do. So we get reincarnated, and the being goes, yep, we still have an agreement, and they're hanging out with us. And they don't usually mean us any harm, but they're just like, I can't leave and you don't remember. And so a lot of times they're just trying to get your attention. It's like somebody tapping on the back of your shoulder, going, hey, remember me? But that tap on the shoulder can cause all sorts of things depending on how long they've been doing it. It's like a toddler who starts off slow and builds into something ridiculously loud, and you're still trying to figure out what's going on sometimes, especially if you're not paying attention. But non-human things can be anything, and this is one thing that I love about my practice. One thing I really love to teach is, let's learn what else is in the world with us that we share this reality with, that in this day and age we don't pay attention to anymore. So like dragons have been present for me my entire lifetime. They don't exist in the 3D in our world today, and probably not ever. And dragon is a type of non human being. So for me, they're like a mythical being category. So you can see all the mythical beings that you read about in fairy tales, they exist in the spirit world. The other thing that you often find are nature type beings. So there's like elemental beings. There can also be spirits of trees and plants, and spirit of the ocean, spirit of a place, spirit of a mountain is really common. You also see other dimensional type beings. So you might see things that belong in a different plane. Demons are an exception. A lot of clients show up with me and saying they have a demon. Most people do not. A demon was categorized in the Catholic Church a long time ago as being anything not human.
Mhm.
And so if we've been calling not human things demons based on the Catholic Church for a long time, and they're stuck and they're usually irritated, they look darker to people who can see them or feel them, and so they get categorized as a demon. And if we've been calling them a demon for 200 years and you ask them what they are, they'll tell you they're a demon because that's what we call them.
Mhm.
And there are actual demons. They're much, much, much rare. So most of the time when I find a demon, it's a being that's stuck and hurt. And once I start acknowledging them and talking to them and helping clear some of the pain and some of the stuckness, they lighten right up. And you're like, oh, you're not a demon. You're a a fairy, an elf, a gnome, a tree, a place, a ancestral helping spirit. You see animals as helping spirits, especially here in North America, because it's part of the indigenous tradition. You see them in lots of cultures, but you definitely see them here when they're around. Does that make sense? There's an infinite number of non-human things.
It makes a lot of sense. Thank you. That's very
Yeah.
interesting. And I guess, how do they affect differently than, say, ancestors? Is it a worse experience or is it similar? I'm just curious.
It can be similar if they don't mean us any harm, because our ancestors generally don't mean us any harm. But if they're bound, say, from a curse, and the binding is to not allow us to do something or to punish us for something, their intention can be much worse.
Hmm.
Because, say, a common curse that I would see in my practice is around love. So if you're not allowed to have a happy marriage, you remove the being and suddenly you don't have all the stress that you had in your marriage before, because the being was the one creating that chaos energy, creating drama, creating conflict,
Ah,
creating blocks. Like, another common thing I'll see is people who can't find a relationship, and they show up with me going, why can't I ever find a relationship? I'm like, oh, you're cursed not to ever be in love. So you remove that curse and suddenly they meet somebody. So I had a client a week or two ago who came in and said, every woman in my family has gotten divorced at age 41, and I'm worried because I'm 40. And I was like, oh, that's every single woman in your family has gotten a divorce at 41. That's obviously not a mistake. So let's play with that.
How does a curse come about? Can you explain a little about that?
Curse has a real specific meaning in the West, which usually comes with dark and scary and mean and horrible. And they don't have to be. So I've started redefining a curse as a kind of a structure or an energy structure. So a curse is simply an intention, a target, and some type of power source. So those three things together create the structure of a curse. So if we break those three things apart, the intention, curses can also be really intentional and can also be kind of by mistake, which is why I'm like, let's get away from the dark, horrible, meant to cause harm definition, because I think a lot of parents curse their children. Again, it's not intentional. The intention, maybe you want them to do well in school. And so you have this really strong intention. You really want them to do well in school. And the target is either a specific child or all of your children. So the target can be a group, the target can be an individual. And then how do you give it power? So the ones that are unintentional from, say, a parent, it's our personal power. We all have a certain amount of personal power, some more than others. It can be a strong emotion. Maybe they just failed an exam and you're all riled up about that. So you have some personal power, you have some emotion, and then, like I said earlier, we have a lot of ancestors hanging out. And so grandma goes, yeah, you're right. They really should do better in school. And so suddenly your power is grandma, emotion, personal power. Target is your kids. The intention is do well in school. And most of us, our kids graduate and we think, oh, great, they're done. And it kind of cancels it out. But maybe you had something that doesn't really end. And so it just continues on. And then your kids have kids. And sometimes we pass that on to our kids. And that's how it continues. So that would be an example of something's unintentional. The intentional ones, if we go back to love, arranged marriage used to be a lot more common in the States. It's still common other places. But so maybe, and I see a lot of curses in the 400 to 500 year range, which we can talk about why that is. So there's a reason. So 400 years ago, our families were doing an arranged marriage, and maybe we were dating, or this person was dating someone else around that time. The family goes, oh, here's your arranged marriage. It's not the person you were dating. And you go off and get married. And the person you were dating is going, hey, that's not fair. We were a thing. We were supposed to get married. This is where we get to who's the target. Are they mad at your family for arranging a marriage that didn't include them? If so, the target could be your family. And or are they mad at you? You didn't pick me, you didn't fight your family. I'm mad at you specifically. So then the target is you. And that target really matters, because if the target is the family, then every generation of the family after carries the intention of that curse. And it just continues on until it causes so much trouble, or you just incidentally run into someone like me who goes, oh, that's a really strange pattern. And let's talk about that. And then what I'm doing to undo it is I'm going back to my guides and saying, hey, can you show me where this begins? What are the fuels? What is the target? How did they put it together? How can we undo this? But say if you take not the family, but they're mad at me personally. Well, now I reincarnate with it. So
Mhm.
every single lifetime I have this problem, but it's not necessarily my family with a problem, it's me with a problem. So that's using love as an example, but I see it in love a lot. The other one you see a lot is around a business conflict. And curses also get triggered by something specific happening. Just another client example. She was in her mid 40s. She decided to open an apothecary. She'd had a fairly normal life before that. The moment she decided to open the apothecary, everything went wrong. Like everything. And she's like, I got in a car accident. My shop got broken into, got in a fight with my husband. And she could list like 10 things that had gone wrong. And she goes, I don't know what's going on. My life's completely out of flow. Somebody said I should talk to you. Out of flow is a real common thing with a curse. When suddenly nothing works in your life, that's when you're like, okay, what's causing that? So that's why you want to show up with someone like me. And we're like, okay, what's going on? And the guys go, oh, she has an ancestral curse about owning an apothecary. And apparently, 5 or 6 generations ago, her family owned an apothecary and the family got cursed. Well, the apothecary closed. 6 generations later, she doesn't know her family used to own an apothecary. But the moment she decided to open the apothecary, the curse went, nope, you're not allowed to do that. And everything started going wrong. And so you're like, okay, how does the curse know 6 generations later that I have a curse about opening an apothecary? And that's what makes it fun for me. How does the curse know? So you're like, okay, what are the fuels of this curse? Like, there's something that's tracking. What's tracking? How does it know? And that's when I was like, oh, one of the fuels is a being. And it's usually a non human being that's going, I'll just hang out here doing my thing as long as you don't do this. I don't care. But the moment you do, then it triggers the curse. And so when we start talking about non human things and are they causing problems, like, well, it depends on whether or not you trigger it. So, like, if she had never opened an apothecary, she would have never have known. And the non human being that was around would never have bothered her. So, curses are fascinating.
You can say that again. Oh my goodness.
I know this is really fascinating. And I have a question about curses. What is the fuel? Is it ever the energy of the curse itself that's propelling it forward through time, as opposed to an entity carrying it?
It can be if it's not a trigger specific thing. So, like, I don't know, say you get really, I don't want to put this on anybody. Say somebody gets really mad at somebody else, and the words and all the energy behind it is, I hope you have a horrible life. There is no satisfying, I hope you have a
Mm,
horrible life. You can always have a more horrible life, and there's no need to trigger anything. So once you start
mm.
having a bad life, that creates its own sort of energy and it just keeps propelling it along.
Kathleen and I know so many of our listeners believe thoughts are things. Thoughts have
They are.
energy. This puts the exclamation point on that whole idea.
Thoughts are definitely energy. And that's a general shamanic principle. Thoughts are definitely energy. But when you start talking about curses, they can take on a power of their own. And when I'm teaching students, that's kind of the big takeaway. I was like, what you wish on people has good power. I think that manifestation and cursing are flip sides of the same coin. If you are a really strong manifester, you have a lot of personal power, which means you also have a strong ability to curse. And most of us are good people. We do not mean to be causing harm for other people. We get mad. We're human. It's totally normal to get mad. Even me, who does this professionally, I get mad. I catch myself saying things. I was like, oh, I don't want to actually do that. I just blowing off steam. When I have students that do that, I was like, when you catch it, and you will eventually, no matter how mad you are, as you start to calm down, you'll catch it. I was like, let's cancel that. Can I pull that energy back? I don't
Mhm.
actually want to do that.
Yeah, that's good.
And I mean that works really well because our intention has a lot of power.
Yes, I went through a whole phase in my life where I got really aware of what words I was choosing. And I would catch myself and I'd say cancel, delete
Exactly.
to intend that I deactivated that thought energy. That leads me to ask you if our thoughts can create these curses, then it makes sense then. If we wish good things for people, is that a positive? I mean, curse? I wouldn't want to use that word, but is that a positive binding energy that helps support the person?
It is, but it's also without their consent.
Mm.
What if what you want for them, what you think is best for them, isn't what they want for themselves and what they don't think is helpful? Which is what I mean by I try, like, I use the word curse a lot because it's the structure, but curses are neutral. It's the intention that makes them positive or negative. And it's also how they age over time. What might be beautifully supportive today, and it's on a specific person because you're really wanting to support that person. So, will that intention still be good for that person in 3 lifetimes because we didn't give it an end date? This is where I really see a lot of things that are meant to be positive or meant to be protective causing harm is maybe, or say, around the time of witchcraft. And an elder in the family said, I don't want my children to show any sign of a gift or any sign of anything that could be labeled witchcraft. It wouldn't be safe for the family. It's not safe to have those gifts in public. So that seems like a fairly reasonable restriction to put on a small child who may not have self control or knowledge of how the world works. And sometimes they're actually quite complex and they're beautiful. So an elder might have set it up that said, when you reach these levels of maturity, or this elder says you have this level of skill, then they start modifying and changing so that as you grow and mature, they come off of you. But that requires someone to monitor them. So if someone set it up like that, but no one alive is monitoring them anymore, then it leaves you at that strongest level of restriction. If you have a strong gift or you're around someone who is triggering things for you, suddenly all of the enforcement mechanism is in play. So, like, you want to learn Reiki? Nope, you're not going to be able to show up. You're going to get sick. You're not going to be able to find the building. Like, when I started teaching or studying Reiki, they're like, if you're not ready, it just won't work, which is true. But also, if your ancestors or a curse says you can't do that, it also just doesn't work because that's kind of the enforcement of the curse.
Hmm. That is some powerful information, Gail. It definitely brings home how powerful our words are and what they have the potential to unleash, truly. And I know Andrea and I have spoken about this before and how it's so important to choose our words with some intention behind them. And I think that's true of everyone, not just people like us who work in the spiritual community, but for anyone, because they have power, they have energy, just as thoughts have energy. I teach that in my Reiki classes, as I imagine Andrea does too. Thoughts are things, they are energy forms that can ultimately be a detriment to us. So I've never heard it explained quite the way you did. And the information on the curses, I just find fascinating.
I love them. I think they're really, really interesting. And the curse is always about, I mean, the fuel is always about the person who sets it up, the cursor. So, like, when I undo them for clients, I will always tell you where I am in time because they can be from this lifetime, but they're often old. Where am I in time? What was going on around you or them when it got set? What is the actual intention? The power source, the fuel, that's all about the person who set it up and not generally about the person living with it. And I don't generally share that, but that is where the complexity and the interest is for me as a practitioner. Like, that's like, okay, well, how did they set that up? And it's fascinating to go and look that up and play with it. And I've been studying, which seems kind of odd from the outside, but I love studying cursing and magic because not that I would do that, I wouldn't set a curse on someone, but learning the different ways that people set them up really helps me
Mhm.
learn how to take them apart.
How do these energies react when you step in the circle and you begin tinkering with what they've set up?
There's lots of traditions for doing spirit attachment work and curse work, and some of them are more compassionate and kind than others. A promise I've made in the work, which is a fairly strong promise, I guess I'll back up a little bit. My teacher teaches compassionate depossession, and she teaches, unraveling curses with compassion as well. I took all of that and I always want to approach it from a compassionate standpoint. But I took it one step further and said, I promise not to force anyone to do anything. That's my promise in the work as a practitioner. And does that mean that sometimes I can't help? Maybe it does, because if I promise not to force them, it means I can't force them to leave. But that allows everything to talk to me. And again, I hear everything. So before I made that promise, what happened was that things would be like, oh no, it's someone with my energy signature, someone who can do this type of work. And they hide.
Mm.
And so then we spend the entire hour trying to get the thing that's hiding from me to come talk to me so that we can talk about whether or not I can compassionately help it.
Mm.
I got frustrated with that. I was talking to my guides and I was like, how do we make this easier? I have a strong belief in past lives. You have to for the type of work that I do. One of the things that I got asked in my training was go and ask your helping spirits to show you a lifetime where you had some interaction with this type of work. When I asked that question, she started to giggle. And I was like, what is going on? I've never heard this guy giggle before. And she started flipping me back through every single lifetime. And she went back like 3,000 years. I've been doing this type of work for 3,000 years, every single lifetime. And so she says, with your energy signature, she's telling me later, not in that journey, with your energy signature, what used to happen for me to collect fuel to use for other type of work, I'd be like, oh, sure, I'll help remove this from Kathleen. Someone paid me to curse Andrea. I'll pull it off of Kathleen and I'll put it on Andrea. And so I wasn't ever helping the beings. I was like, I'll pull it off of here and put it there. And they're like, so of course they hide from you. They're like, you might help remove it from this client, but then what are you going to do with it? And is it better or worse than where they are now? And I was like, well, I don't want to do that. And she's like, no, but you need to make, like, that's what kind of precipitated my promise in the work. I promise not to force anyone to do anything. So you can come and mock me, which sometimes they do. They don't do that very often anymore, or come and cuss at me, which they've also done, but they don't do very much anymore. But if I do help you leave, I'm going to help you go home.
Mm-hmm.
And I now have a kind of a reputation for that in spirit. I've done this enough years that they're like, oh, it's you. Yeah, I'll talk to you. You'll help me go home. And it has become a much smoother thing at a really kind of high level. When I find a spirit attachment that's not human and I'm actually talking to it, then what I'm asking my guides to do is, hey, can we give it energy that's coming from the guides and not coming from the human they're sitting with? And can I ask for another being that's similar to them to come and join this conversation? One that is healthy, one that is whole, one that's coming from their world. Can they open a doorway between our world and their world to do that, which builds trust? And I was like, okay, well, now I can see the being that's hanging out with my client is dark or heavy or dense. And the being that came in to help them is light and bright and sparkly and floaty. And I was like, okay, that tells me where the energy is wrong. And so that's what we're doing is trying to heal their energy to make it match the being that came to help them. And whatever that takes, and there's lots of different ways we can do that. And usually once it matches and they're no longer bound here, they're like, thank you very much, and they leave. And it's incredibly rare. I probably do 20 to 30 hours a week of this particular type of work. And in the last 5 years, I've had two beings. So it's really rare that they stay, but it's always with compassion. So it may take me a little bit longer than if I just went, yep, you don't belong here, pluck. But the thing is, once I do that, what do I do with them? If I go, nope, you don't belong here, I'm going to yank you out, which probably will hurt everybody because they're like, no, as they try and hold on and stay. And the client's going, what's happening as you rip this thing out from the roots inside of me, which would be the not compassionate way to do it. But then if I said, okay, you don't belong here, and I'm just going to sit you out on the street over here, you're no longer with my client. My work is done, dusted. What are they going to do? I didn't help them go home. They're still bound to our world. They still know you. So the next time you walk out to leave your house, they're like, great, I know her. I'll just go hang out with her again. Very temporary relief. Or somebody else walks down the street and goes, okay, great, and I got a new person. So I've just kind of given the problem to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So I really want to say, okay, who are you? How did you get here? Do you want to be here? Where you belong? The same kinds of things you'd ask a lost person. So I would ask the lost being, no matter what it is. And because I've promised not to force them, they might go, you're a stupid human, or call me something else. Or they might say, hey, I ended up here for this reason. And yeah, I enjoy it. This is what I get out of it. So the conversations are fascinating.
You alluded to that the spirits sort of know you, like you've got a reputation or something in the spirit world. And I'm wondering, what are the boundaries like for you? I mean, how do you have healthy boundaries in this work? What does it look like?
That's a very, very, very good question. And for me, the boundaries started before I ever started doing this work. And again, it goes back to being able to hear. And as I started getting my mastery in Reiki, I got more and more sensitive as an empath. So it started with, okay, this is overwhelming for me. I don't want to hear anything that isn't directed at me, about me, or related to my safety. And that became the rules. I don't want to hear the random thing that's attached to somebody else walking down the street. At the time, I was working in downtown San Francisco, so the noise was deafening. So I started kind of limiting down. What do I want to hear? What do I not want to hear? What do I want to feel? What do I not want to feel? And so then I was like, okay, so now I kind of know, but how do you hold that? What do you do with that? And I find I can set that intention and hold it for an hour or two, but then I'm really fatigued and I lose it and it just kind of falls away. So then I went back to my guides and went, okay, I work downtown for 8 hours with an hour commute each direction. Like I need this to last 10 hours, or 11 hours. How does that happen? Then they're like, well, start with a bubble, which a lot of people have heard. Start with a bubble.
Mhm.
Define what is and is not allowed in your bubble. And I was like, okay. And that helped a little bit, but I still had to like consciously hold it. And I was like, okay, I'm still really overwhelmed. Dragon is a guardian spirit for me. And I went back to Dragon and went, what do I do? And he goes, why do you think you have to hold this all by yourself? And I went, oh. So then I was like, oh, well, can you hold this for me? And if he holds it for me, it lasts for a really long time. He has way more energy than I do. And then it became a matter of fine tuning. And I teach a boundaries class in my practice. I help any client that shows up completely overwhelmed. Let's start talking about boundaries. And then, like I told you, they have to get really specific. I'm HSP, which probably a lot of your listeners are highly sensitive. When I said I don't want to feel anything but me, I actually got really nervous because suddenly all this information I'm used to having, I didn't have anymore. It honestly really freaked me out. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering what was going to hit me that I wasn't aware of. And I was like, okay, I do want to still have some knowledge of the room. I still want to have some ability to feel what's going on around me. I do still want to hear some things. This was a funny story. I used to have really, like, we started talking about I don't want to hear anything was the boundary because I was like, oh, I can make the voices stop. I was so excited. And then things started disappearing out of my house. My mom passed, I guess, almost 6 years ago now. When she had cancer, my dad bought her a new Kindle so that she'd have something to read while she was going through her cancer treatment. And I love to read. And when my mom died, my dad gave the Kindle to me because he doesn't like to read or didn't like to read. So it was like the one thing from my mom related to my mom's passing. It really meant a lot to me. I had another Kindle. It wasn't that I didn't, but that one meant a lot to me. And it was the first Reiki class that I taught or co taught with someone and had 30 people in it. She used to run really big classes and then invite other Reiki masters to help with the attunement that she had trained. So it was a fun lineage thing. But so I was reading this book, I put it down, I got in the shower, I came back, it was gone. And I was like, where'd it go? I'm like, I live in a studio, it can't have gone that far. And looking, couldn't find it anywhere. And get to the second day of the Reiki class, and I was complaining to my Reiki teacher, I was now helping with her class, and she was also a shamanic teacher. And she goes, "Can I make a suggestion?" She's really careful about that, so I was like, "Well, I'm probably not going to like this suggestion, but yes." And she goes, "So who are you not listening to?" And I was like, "Oh," and I realized I was boundering out beings that wanted my attention that were helpful. And in this case, it was a fairy. So I wasn't listening to the fairies, and the fairies were mad about it. And they stole my Kindle to get my attention. And they did. It made me really mad, but they also got me to adjust my boundaries. So something you do want to hear, using my gifts as an example, or you do want to see if you're more visual, or you do want to know if that's your gifts. Everyone has different gifts and needs different boundaries, but the way of kind of thinking about boundaries. And then when I get into a client session, then I have a lot more helping spirits present in a client session. And I need to know more things than I would in my day-to-day life. Over time, I'm in my home, but this is an office in my home, and it has different boundaries than the rest of my home. Some things are allowed in this room that are not allowed, say, in my bedroom. They're allowed in session because I have other helping spirits that are present. But then those things have to go away when I close the session. So I'm ritually opening, ritually closing a session. And in the middle, where I'm got a bunch of helping spirits and I'm working, then I know and feel and hear a lot more than I do in my day-to-day life.
I guess a follow-up would be when you change the boundaries, when you set the boundaries that you're talking about, what does that look like? Is that you talking out loud, addressing your guides or the dragon or whomever you are? I mean, what is that like?
It depends on what's going on for me. Energetic boundaries are often like human boundaries that you have a problem when you get mad. You're like, okay, there's a boundary violation there. I'm upset, or something's going on that I don't like. If it's in the heat of the moment, I might just say, hey, can you add this to my boundaries? And I don't look at my boundaries holistically. I'm like, I don't want to know that. Can that stay out of my boundaries? And sometimes looking at it more holistically, I try and look at my boundaries once a month or so and say, okay, things have changed in my life. I am okay knowing this or not knowing that. And then I might do it more holistically, and then I do it more ritualistically. So I might sit and write a list. I might do it in journey space. I might go back to my guides and say, hey, what would my life feel like if I changed my boundaries to be this? Or if I change my boundaries to be that, and I can see which one feels better in journey space. And then I would say, okay, can you make them whatever it is that we just decided? Does that kind of make sense? It happens differently depending on what's going on in my life.
Yes. I appreciate actually hearing some examples like writing a list or something like that. It gives me a little something to hang on to there. So, yeah, I appreciate that.
Writing a list can be really important because then I can go back to it and go, oh, that was what that was. Or, oh, I forgot I said that.
Right.
When you start running into things like stubbing your toes, you're like, why isn't this working? And the guide's like, you said you didn't want to. It's like, oh, sorry, can we change that?
I have a story about boundaries and spirits. Shortly after my father died 14 years ago, I was so grief stricken and I closed myself off because I didn't want to feel that pain. I also identify as an HSP. I mean, I check all the boxes. So sometimes I just feel like I have to close down in order to protect myself. And back then, I didn't know as much about energy as I do now. So I just sort of shut it down because I still had my mother to deal with, who was just in terrible shape because of this. I would just push it away, push it away. I started noticing that things were missing from my house, like you described. For example, the weirdest one, the one that first got my attention, was my parents had purchased a gift card for me the previous Christmas, which was only a month before my father passed away. I couldn't find it. I always keep them in one particular place. It was just gone. It was absolutely gone. I quizzed my sons. Did anybody take my gift card? No, we really didn't. Blame us for everything, Mom. But so there was that. And then at that time, we had a little dog who slept in our bedroom in a crate at night. My father loved that little dog. He got the biggest kick out of this dog. I noticed in the morning, the door to his crate would always be open. Every night we would close it, but it was open. And I'm like, what is going on? So I knew enough about spirit guides and things like that. So I touched in and said, I need some help here. I don't know what's happening. Am I losing my mind? What came to me was it was my father. He was trying to let me know that I needed to feel my feelings because I needed to help my mother. One of the things he had said to me prior to his passing was, please take care of your mother. And I promised him I would do that. But he wanted me to grieve and get it out. Not that he wanted me to be a miserable wreck. He wanted me to feel it so I could move on. And this was his way of getting in touch. Anyway, that was a lesson in boundaries. I had them too tight. And I forgot all about that until you shared your story. So thanks.
It's a wonderful story. It is really amazing to me how our loved ones can be in touch when they have this healthy process and they've moved into spirit. My mom loved hummingbirds, and so she'd show up. Like I'd see random hummingbirds when I knew my mom was around. So I love
Mhm.
that story.
People talk all the time. And even Kathleen said just now, I talk to my guides and I ask them, well, how can we address our guides and know that we aren't asking attachments or the attachments aren't influencing the answers that we think we're receiving from our guides? Do you have some advice for us on that?
Yeah. It's a great question because some people with really active attachments, the attachment does become or tries to become a guide. I tend to think if your body disagrees, you want to check and see who you're talking to. If the advice is really specific and like you must do this, I find most of our guides aren't that requirement based. If you're getting advice unasked for, that's definitely not healthy. So if you're like, well, my guide said this, and I was like, well, did you ask them? If the answer is no, it's probably an attachment. They respect our sovereignty. So if you don't ask, you don't get, which is another big lesson in the work. I was like, if you want help, you need to ask. And if you're not asking and you're receiving help, that's a big flag for me. I would look at that. And I think most HSPs, we're pretty sensitive in our physical bodies. Last year, I kept getting told, move to the East Coast, move to the East Coast. But my whole body was going, no. And I was like, okay, where is the move to the East Coast coming from compared to the physical body going no? Or is the physical body that has a problem that doesn't want change or movement? And the guides really are saying move to the East Coast. But it kind of comes back to where I didn't ask if I should move to the East Coast. I've lived out here since 1988. This is my home. So I was like, what is going on with that? And so that's kind of an example of how, you know, do they actually have your best interests at heart? It's not that our guides can't tell us hard things, because they can, but we asked generally, and you start getting confirmation in different places. So, like for me, when I was getting told I needed to start my practice full time, I was still working for the government. I had a fairly high level analytical job, made pretty good money. And so they're like, you need to quit your job and open your practice. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm a single person in San Francisco. You're nuts. But that was true guide advice. And I was like, I'm scared. They're like, well, no, that's what you're supposed to be doing in the world. I was like, well, I don't know about that. It took me a little over a year to open my practice, to be honest. But then I started getting the advice everywhere. I run in a lot of woo energetic type circles. And every time I would run into a gifted friend, they would literally do the exact same thing. They would tilt their head to the right and they'd say, your guides say you have to choose. And it happened over and over and over. And I was like, okay, so that's an example of getting a piece of advice that you don't like, but it's coming from everywhere.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And so is it prying if I ask you about the East Coast thing? What answer did you receive about that?
I am from the East Coast originally. My family immigrated to the United States in the mid 1600s in the northern Florida, southern Georgia area, and have a lot of ancestral energy there. And I think what was happening was that they wanted me to come clear the land. It became a big thing about me clearing the land. So I had a task that was in the East Coast.
Oh,
And when I realized it was the task that was required and not necessarily the moving, then I was like, well, I'm happy to help clear the land. What is the task that needs to happen there for me? And but one question that I would also be telling other people to ask who's giving you the task. Is it something you agreed to do or your ancestors agreed to do? Or is it, again, where is it coming from? Anyone who studies with me for very long, I'm adamant about knowing where your messages come from. I think it's really important. That's not something I can teach you how to do in 5 minutes, but that's something as a student of mine that maybe a little bit more adamant about than most, simply because I can hear them.
mm,
And so it's like I'm hearing it in words. So I want to know who says that. And if I'm going to tell a client something that I'm hearing and it's a little harsh, I definitely want to know who it came from.
Mhm.
So it's not my goal to cause harm.
and then certainly it would have been in your purview to say, "Oh, I understand the task you're asking me to do, but I choose not to." I mean, correct?
Right.
And then are there any ramifications of doing that?
There definitely can be. When you start talking about tasks like that, it's like, well, why is it my task? Do I have an agreement, or is there a contract? Is the agreement with me personally, or is it with my ancestral line? So what is the impetus behind the task? So I'm looking for that with clients when you're like, I feel honor bound to do this. I'm like, really? Honor bound? That's a really interesting choice of words. That generally leans back to an old agreement or contract. So contracts and agreements are something that can be renegotiated frequently. That's also one of the reasons why we have non-human things with us, is we have an agreement to do something with a non-human ally. And so the non-human ally is going, you must do this. Come on, I'm bound to you until we do this thing. And so you're like, I've had this agreement to do this thing. I don't know why. And I'm like, oh, okay. So it's kind of one of the ways that they get bound. And they get undone or changed, very similar to a curse. I'm asking my guides, hey, can you take me to that moment in time when we made this agreement? And is the agreement still valid in today's world? Was the agreement meant to be more than that one human lifetime? Again, getting back to humans saying forever when that's not actually what we mean. We mean in this lifetime, I promise to do this thing. We don't mean I will promise to do this thing forever. And usually that's the easiest fix is going back to the moment we made the agreement and subbing the word forever for in this lifetime or in this incarnation. And then that makes it no longer relevant today. I personally feel that it is my it's funny, I'm hearing the word duty. It is my duty to help with the land because of my gifts and how much the land supports me in my practice. It's a reciprocity thing for me. I feel like I am duty bound to help the land or to help the spirits that are belong with the land
Mm.
because they do so much help for me in my client work. I am honored to be able to do it in return when asked. And so it is a duty, but it's also an honor. And I think there is an agreement there for me personally, and it's one I'm happy to uphold.
That's really incredible. You had said something earlier about how common the attachments are for people. And I'm wondering, you do work to help clear these from people and their influence and that kind of thing. Do they also just naturally come and go? What if someone doesn't come for a session? Can they come and go? Are there practices that we do every day or perhaps without even knowing it that help release the attachments?
Attachments can come and go, especially when they're ancestral in nature, because if they've been with the ancestral line for 500 years, there's a lot of humans that have been born in 500 years since that moment in time that they got bound to the line. And they can stay with any of us that are incarnated. So they might come see what you're up to and then go hang out with your great aunt. They don't have to stay with you, they can be anywhere in the line. So sometimes you'll see them come and go in that way. And for me, as a practice, if say you have an appointment with me and they don't want to be helped to leave, then they might go, oh, you have an appointment with her. I'll go hang out over here. And then I don't see them. And you're like, well, I'm seeing all these things. And sometimes my guides will be like, you need to ask the being that is causing this to come join the session.
Oh,
And so again, I'm not forcing them to join the session, but I am inviting them with the promise that I won't force them to do anything. I'm like, come back and talk to us, please, because they generally don't mean to cause harm, but they are. And so they need to understand how they are, why they are, how they can help from the spirit realm and be not attached, but involved with the family. And by helping them move to spirit, I'm not telling them to go away. I'm just saying, I need you to help in this way instead of helping by staying actively attached in our world.
but do some of them actually want to be disruptive, actually want to be negative influences?
Yes, definitely. And when they want to be negatively influencing or they are required to be negatively influencing because of a curse or an agreement, then they definitely don't want to leave. And when they're bound in that way, then they generally also don't run from me because I've said I'm not going to force you. So those are the ones that stay and usually talk smack. You're not going to force me to leave and da 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 da. So it's interesting when they do that. It always gives really good information when they do that. But if they don't want to leave, they don't come and go. They stay.
And then in a session with you, if your client learns of this influence and you tell them, yeah, they're not going to leave, I'm assuming that you would say that in a session, can the person then do anything to get them to leave because it is their energy? Can you speak about that?
Yes. Again, just because they don't want to leave doesn't mean they won't leave. So the question is, why don't they want to leave? If the reason they tell you they don't want to leave is because they're bound through this curse or agreement, then, and sometimes they don't tell me the truth because they're not required to. So, this is why I'm always working with a set of guides. If they're talking smack or I'm like, that doesn't feel right based on my experience or the energy that I'm feeling around the being, then I'm like, okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you to step aside and I'm going to ask a different guide that I have an actual relationship with to say, okay, why do they want to stay? And do they have anything binding them here? And if they do, then I will address the binding because I can do that based on the client going, I don't want this being here. And I'm not forcing them to leave by addressing the binding. So I'm maintaining my promise. I'm just removing the things that require them to stay.
Mm.
So if I'm working with my guides to remove what requires them to stay, and then I go back and say, hey, do you still want to stay? And they're no longer required to. 9 times out of 10, they're like, no, I don't want to stay here. And then it's like, okay, now can we invite another person to come help you? Can you start shifting your energy, open doorways? So it's a negotiation. It's always a negotiation. I'll use one as an example who was like, I am not leaving. They had agreements with one of the indigenous tribes, and it was set on this soul, and it had been reincarnating with this soul as punishment. So there was nothing I could do to relieve him of the responsibility of punishment. He needed to go back to the tribe that set it and have their indigenous people remove it. And that's an extreme case. Again, it's only happened once. So most of the time I would say, hey, can I speak to the spirit of the being that said it? And can you determine that this punishment has been marked complete? But the being wasn't accepting any of that. The way that it was bound was not going to allow a white woman to release that being. It's just not going to happen.
My jaw's just hanging open there. Wow.
So what happened there, Gail? Did this individual have to go to the indigenous tribe and ask to have the curse
He
released?
did.
Oh my goodness.
He did. And it took him a few months to find a way to be able to actually do that. And I could make a recommendation of someone to talk to, but it wasn't the correct tribe. But then that person could then help him talk to someone in a different tribe. It was definitely the game of telephone. I sent him to someone who was a kind of an entry into that world, who then had to help him get an entry into where he actually needed to be.
That is amazing.
And can you describe what was the influence on this particular client? What was he seeing in his life that would have shifted after he had it properly removed?
It was opening portals to other worlds and bringing in more and more beings. And so he was never able to get clear with that other energy with him.
Oh, wow. I would imagine that would be extremely unsettling and disruptive, I guess.
And then he was using substances to give him a little bit of separation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a very complex thing. So even if, I could close the doors, which we did, but they would just get reopened. It was just, he needed different help than me.
Mm-hmm.
I've often heard this just in our spiritual circles that addictions, drugs, alcohol really do open the opportunity for attachments to be in concert with us. And so you would agree with that then?
They definitely do. The thing that I tell people who are really concerned about attachments is to watch their energy hygiene. So, how do you maintain your physical boundaries and how do you stay full of energy? So, if we're full of energy, then there's no place for them to attach with us. It's when we get tired, sick, or on any type of substance, then our boundaries aren't as firm. We have more energetic holes. And that's where they're like, yep, you got a hole. I'm going to hang out with you. So you're much more susceptible if your energy hygiene isn't very good. And any type of substance definitely you're not as fully embodied when you're on a substance.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you step out of your body a little bit through this substance, something else can step in.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have an active attachment, that's one common way that they try and be more in control. So if you're fully mindful and embodied, then they're still with you, but you're in control. If you go off to the bar and have a couple of drinks, well, now they're in control.
Mm.
If you're like, this only happens when I'm drinking, and my doctor says that's not a normal alcohol side effect. So let's look at what is hanging out with you that is now, I'm more in control when you're not. And does that make sense?
Right. Well, or people that say, oh, he's just the nicest guy. But then when he drinks, he turns into a whole nother person.
Exactly.
What we're saying is there could really be this explanation.
There could be a whole nother person, or it could be that's what's going on underneath that they mask.
And is that also the little voice of addiction where the person's just having their life and they're thinking they're doing well? Maybe they have a little affinity for some alcohol, but then the voice comes in saying, oh, let's have a drink. Let's have a drink. That could actually be the influence of the spirit.
It definitely could, because again, they're not in a body anymore. So anything they want, they have to get through you.
Mm.
So if you look at the reasons why humans choose not to cross over, vast majority of them are wanting to help the living. But then you get beyond that, some of the other reasons why they choose to stay is maybe if you have a strong heaven hell cosmology and you think I haven't earned heaven and I don't want to go to hell, so I'm just going to stay here. Makes perfect sense to me. Or the opposite. There is no afterlife and you're still here. So, of course, you would stay here. But a couple of clients that work for one of the big tech companies here in San Francisco, they talk amongst themselves, obviously, but one of them will come see me and then they'll be talking in the office and someone will say, yeah, I was drinking the other night and suddenly I want cigarettes. I don't even like cigarettes. And they'll be like, oh, you got to go see Gail. They pick stuff up in the bar because they're like, well, I don't want to hang out with my family. I want to drink and smoke. That's why I didn't earn heaven. So I'm just going to hang out in the bar. And then they just move around from people who are inebriated enough to have space.
What an enlightening conversation.
Most definitely. I've heard stories about how people who have passed that were addicts will search for a host that will help them continue that addiction vicariously. I would imagine that that's something that happens. I've read more than one story about such things that were pretty well documented, and that always really stuck with me. So when we moved into talking about addicts here, that was the first thing that came to mind. Is that something that you've ever encountered, that the individual who has passed, the human entity, was an addict looking for a place to land?
Yes, definitely. This is where we get into my promise not to force them to leave because they don't want to leave.
Right.
So it's like, okay, well, how do I convince them that leaving is actually better for them? Because if they have the fear of hell, then that's different from I have a strong craving for alcohol or any other substance and I want to stay here because I want that craving or I want that substance. For me, that changes who I request. When I work with ancestors that are present, I'm asking for a healthy ancestor that hopefully they knew when they were alive that can kind of explain the process and what their options are when they move over. So it's not coming from me. Otherwise, they argue with me. You're not my religion, my cosmology. You just want me to leave. And that's not helpful for anyone. So I'm
Mhm.
asking for one of their relatives that can have that discussion with them. When I run into someone who has an addiction issue, then I switch. Instead of asking for an ancestor, I ask for someone in spirit who can help talk about their options for enjoying that substance in the afterlife. Is
Mhm.
that possible? Can they do it? Can they not? What are their options? This may be someone they don't know, but someone who has the same interest. So sometimes that discussion is what helps them go, oh, I mean, I can go hang out in the bar in spirit. And they're like, yeah. And they're like, okay, well, I'm going to go do that. Or I have an interest in magic. My family is born again Christian. I don't want to go hang out with my family in spirit. I want to go hang out with magical workers. And so, same thing. Can I have this time? Usually, I would ask for soul family or magical family instead of blood family. Can they come and help them reunite with a magical community in spirit? The goal is to have everyone get what they want, but to do it in a healthier place. And my role is just to ask for the right help. How do we clear this? How do we heal this? How do we reunite them with the soul family that gets them what they're actually looking for?
Yes, for the benefit of everyone involved. This is absolutely fascinating. And it feels like really important work that you're doing, Gail, truly.
Thank you. I really feel around 400 or 500 years ago, most humans got really into organized religion. And instead of having the natural shamanic type person in every community who used to tend to the spirits and help with this kind of stuff, we moved into an organized religion and we started giving it all to the church. The church doesn't believe in a lot of this stuff. And so we quit tending the dead. We quit tending our old agreements. We quit going, oh, that happened. We should look for a curse. The church went, oh, no, there's no such thing as curses if you believe in God. So we just quit tending them and we quit looking for them and we quit having people undo them. There's definitely curses and beings that have been around longer than 400 or 500 years. But around the 400 or 500 year range, when our families moved more into organized religion, we just quit doing it. I find a lot of things originate around that time period because we just stopped. And and I feel like that this work needs to become more normalized. People need to know when my life is really out of flow, or I have this thought or this physical thing that nobody can make sense of, to start looking in spirit because we need to start tending these things. There's such a backlog over the 400 or 500 years that at this point, pretty much anyone who shows up in my world has something that we can do. It may not be something life altering. Maybe you're one of the lucky families that have been tending this more. And again, I'm a specialist. So you can see some of this stuff with any shamanic practitioner and they go, oh, yeah, I can help you with that. until you get to something kind of crazy. And then the practitioner goes, oh, you're outside of my comfort level. And I get a lot of referrals that way. So they're like, go work with Gail, she'll remove that thing, and then you can come back to me. So I don't generally do ongoing work with people. I really am a specialist. So just like your cardiologist wouldn't become your primary care doctor, I don't want really to be the primary care person for anyone in shamanic work. Am I trained in the full core shamanic stuff? I am. And I think it's important that I am because it helps me see things a certain way. But what I love to do are these beings and curses and weird contracts and agreements. And because of my history with ancestors, I had thousands of ancestors that were unwell that were hanging out around me because I could hear them. Clearing that had major effect through my entire ancestral line. So when I see that with a client, I was like, this is who I worked with, and I would highly recommend working with them. Or we can do it my way, which is slightly different, and start working on it as well because it's causing major impact in your life. And it's just because we quit tending them. The white people definitely do not tend. You start moving into some of the other populations of color, they have much better traditions of tending their ancestors. And that has a totally different feel than when you're running into someone who is white.
What about races and cultures, groups of peoples? Could they be cursed just being in a certain race or culture?
They definitely can. Those are often bigger than one person can undo. But doing them in groups or doing the piece that you can see or unweaving the client or the client's family sitting in front of me from the bigger curse, those are things that definitely we can work with. I just want to be careful as a practitioner that I'm familiar enough that I'm not just imposing white culture on a person of a different culture. I think it's really important to be really mindful of that and respectful of other cultures. It is definitely true that some races and cultures and practices are cursed and that needs to get undone. So it's definitely a knot that needs to be looked at carefully. And it's something I love being able to do when it comes up. That is someplace that I need to tread lightly to make sure that as a white woman that I'm not imposing a white lens somewhere it doesn't belong.
Mm-hmm.
If our audience wants to investigate themselves, their energies, find out if they have these influences around them, can you help them with that? And if so, how do they get in touch with you? And what are you offering? I know you have workshops and some different kinds of sessions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I tend to offer, well, I have three types of sessions. If you're just curious and you're like, what's going on here? Can we look? I would say do a diagnostic session. A diagnostic session would be 30 minutes. I know that a lot of what I do is definitely not mainstream. And so I want people to be really comfortable with it and ask their questions and make sure they understand what it is we're doing. Oftentimes, if people have done a diagnostic and it's just like one thing, they're like, oh, yeah, no, there's this ancestral curse. We can do that in an hour. So I would say book an hour follow up appointment and we can undo this curse in about an hour. If they come back and go, oh, there's a curse, there's an ancestral thing, there's a past life thing, and oh, there's this and that, I was like, oh, yeah, no, that's way more than I can do in an hour. So then generally I would tell people this may take 2 or 3 sessions. It's rare for me to work with people more than 3 or 4 sessions unless they start learning or doing some type of mentorship thing with me.
Fantastic. And all of these different session types are on your website. That's correct?
Right, they're all on my website. All of my booking is done through my website. I'm happy to answer logistical questions via email, but the moment you start saying, this is going on in my life, I'm going to tell you you need to be in session.
Right.
That's back to my boundaries. If you send me that, then I have to boundary up to read it. I don't really want to be having that kind of conversation. So if it's real specific to you, please do that in session.
And we'll, of course, put your links down in the show notes, but your site address is?
It's energyhealingwithspirits.com.
Fantastic. And then your workshops are also on your website, correct?
Right. I love doing short workshops that are 2 or 3 hours long. And then I teach quarterly something short, 2 to 3 hours. It could be about boundaries. It could be interacting with a different type of guide each time. So you can get in and play and practice and ask questions. Then I also teach a longer class that is 16 months long called Let's Get Weird. It's really a fun way of taking all the different ways of working with spirits that I can think of in one class so that you can start playing with lots of different ways and really making it your own. I'd say when I work with clients, the thing I get told the absolute most is that's so weird. So let's get weird. Let's go play with it.
Well, I love it.
I do too. Let's get weird.
I know, and you just can't make this stuff up, right, Kathleen?
Exactly. You cannot.
We have so enjoyed our conversation, Gail. We're so happy that you have joined us here beyond the Reiki Gateway. I am just floored, really, with so much of what you've shared, so much to think about and consider.
Hmm. Oh, yes.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
It has been. I have learned so much, and I thought I had some knowledge about these issues, but my goodness, you've given me a whole new perspective and a newfound desire to delve even deeper. So thank you.
Yeah, I agree. So until next time we meet, we wish you all the best. Thank you for tuning in. We thank you again for joining us. And of course, we invite you to join us next time as we journey beyond the Reiki Gateway with Kathleen Johnson and Andrea Kennedy.